Hi there. What I'm going to talk about today is the service itself, what we're about, survey data, take you through some documentation and tips, have a quick look at the website. So if you've got questions as we go through, there will be a couple of opportunities where I'll break and take questions as well. But put any questions that strike you in the Q&A box, and we'll come back to those later. So first of all, I'd like to ask you something. Now, what we're using here is a bit of software called Mentimeter. So there is a link in the chat to go to this, or you go to that website and type in the code 35098847. And if you just type in the research topic you're interested in, that's got some sense of what people are interested in. So an interesting set of different areas of interest. About half of you have come in, I think, so far. So social sciences figures largest, so more than one of you have said that. Inequalities jumping up. Some interest in COVID. A couple of health things there, social care. Attitudes, community development. I'll give you another minute or two to get something in, but don't worry about, just give us some idea of where we're coming from. So a massive variety really of interests across the social sciences. Be interested in the labour market, okay, that's great. So I think we seem to be stopping there. So that's where your interests come from. So hopefully, looking across most of those things, I think we have data that would support thinking about quite a lot of those, if not all of them, at least in terms of attitudes. So what's the UK Data Service? Well, we're funded by the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council. It provides a single point of access to lots of secondary social science data. So what I mean by secondary is that it's been collected by other people. So it's available for you to use, supported by documentation. And we also offer support, training, events like this, and guidance on our website, which we'll look at later on. And the kind of data we hold, we have kind of UK surveys, which we'll go into in a bit. We have longitudinal data, that's data where the same people or the same households are asked questions over a period of time, so you can look at change over time. We have international macro data taken from sources like the World Bank and the OECD that track a set of indicators over time for different countries. We provide access to census data. There's different types of census data. So as well as the standard census tables that you may be familiar with, we also have microdata and flow data. So microdata is holds a number of variables. It's a sample of the census and enables you to do multivariate analysis with it. We also have flow data, which is used quite a lot to look at travel to work, commuting patterns, and also migration. We have business data, so quite a lot of that, because of commercial sensitivity, is in the secure space, which I'll come back to later. And we also hold qualitative data, so transcripts of interviews, etc., from people who've deposited their data with us. So basically, as a service, we encourage people to deposit the data they work with, and you will find data sets that have been left with us for other researchers to use. So today we're going to focus on surveys, and what we're looking at is largely data about individuals or households. They've been commissioned by government departments and conducted by organisations like the Office for National Statistics, the National Centre for Social Research. They include key characteristics of the individuals and households with large sample sizes. They're designed so that you can make claims about national things, so nationally representative, and they are repeated cross-sections, so same or similar questionnaire with a new sample of people every time. And quite a lot of them are repeated annually. So we'll go into some more details about those. But before we do that, just looking at how the data is stored. So this is survey microdata, and it's, for those of you familiar with SPSS, this is in SPSS, but the output would look similar in other packages. So we have a set of categorical codes covering health, sex, age, marital status, higher education, and ethnicity. And if we look at those, we can see how those are translated into text within SPSS. So we can see from the data that's stored, the description that's attached to that data. And for each row, we're looking at a response to the survey. And for each column, we're looking at a single variable. And in terms of accessing that data, you can download whole data sets and the documentation for those. It comes in 3 different formats: SPSS, data, and tab format. You can also explore it online using a tool called Nestar, which lets us browse variables and the data about them, carry out simple data analysis, and produce tables and graphs, and download subsets of that data. So for the initial exploration, you may well find Nestar is useful to decide whether this is data that's going to be useful for your study. So the key topics we cover, hopefully these address most of those that you raised. There's a whole section on employment and work. The key data set here is the labour force survey, which is supported by the annual population survey. So the annual population survey is a larger set of data, and the labour force survey is carried out every quarter. Participants take part for 5 quarters, so there is also a level of longitudinal analysis properly, but only over a short period of time. We have family finances, which has the details about what people earn, what they spend their money on, etc. A set of things around attitudes and opinions, so the British Social Attitude Survey, the Northern Ireland Life and Times Survey, and access to Eurobarometer and the World Values Survey. In terms of health, we have the Health Survey for England, Scottish Health Survey, and Diet and Nutrition Surveys. Crime and housing and the local environment. Now, these are the big surveys that people tend to use quite a lot. So when you read, for example, I was reading the paper yesterday, and Shelter were talking about the number of people who are in insecure tenure, and that would have come from their analysis of the English Housing Survey. Those kind of data sets are used quite widely, but there's a lot more beneath that that may reflect things that you would be interested in exploring. So just a quick kind of think about this. Now, think this to yourself. Do you think we hold variables that show daily expenditure for 2 weeks, surveyors' reports on properties, blood samples, the number of sexual partners people have, and COVID-19 test results? So how many of those do you think we have? I'm not going to do this in a quiz, but okay, somebody's put in the chat all of them. So have you been looking ahead in my slides? So these are some of the examples of those. So the Living Costs and Food Survey holds information on expenditure and food. Within the English Housing Survey, there's a set of analysis of the condition of housing stock. So we get a surveyor's report on housing conditions. In the health service for England, we collect a blood and saliva tests, as well as taking height and weight measurements. So that's kind of an interesting area of, it's come on more recently, of linking biodata to kind of survey data. The National Survey for Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles asks detailed questions about sexual experiences, behaviours and view. And in terms of COVID, Understanding Society in the last year and a half has looked specifically at test results, vaccination, infection, attitudes towards vaccination, and the kind of social and employment changes arising from COVID. So a big part of that is looking at what's happened to the education of children, for example. So let's go into some of these examples. So the British Social Attitude Survey has run most years since 1983. It asks people about their attitudes to a range of things. I've chosen two of them that have come from recent years. So in recent years, there's been quite a focus on Brexit. As the referendum came up, there's been quite a focus on immigration. They show patterns of continuity and change. So the sample size of this survey is around 3,000. There's a set of core questions that enable us to look at things like social class, age, gender, race, etc., to differentiate the results between different groups of people. And then there are modules on social, economic, political, and moral issues. Some are asked regularly, others less often. What's interesting, I think, about this survey is you can see what the stakeholders for the British Social Attitude Survey have been interested in, because each year they do a headline report on the key findings from the attitude survey. So you can look at what we were concerned about in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and more recently. So I think what we're seeing now is a shift, as there is in public debate, to thinking about the environment, climate change, and all of those kinds of areas that have been brought to the fore, particularly by campaigning groups, but are kind of areas of interest. Whereas in the mid 2010s, the focus seemed to be quite a lot on things like immigration and Brexit, and the kind of role of Britain and how it sat in relation to other places. So here's an example. So in 1987, 48% of people believed that people should have a traditional division. There should be a traditional division of gender roles. So that's declined over time, but what do you think it's declined to? So we're going to go back into Mentimeter now and ask you the question. So ignore the getting more points. So here we are. Was it 33% supporting more traditional gender roles, 23%, 13%, or 3%? We've got about half a minute left. Okay, Joan, your answer is 23. And that seems to be what most people thought. Actually, it declined more than that. It come down to 13%, which I suppose I think is a good thing. And by 2017, it had dropped to 8%. It might be interesting to see how that question will be answered after in the next time it's asked, because the effect of the life we've been living for the last 18 months or 2 years may well have changed attitudes in that way. Another survey we use is the labour force survey. So it's the main source of data on the labour market. It's designed and managed by the Office for National Statistics. For those of you interested, we do sessions on this. There will be a conference early next year with people presenting papers, and there are recordings of existing sessions where ONS have described elements of it. So one of the complexities of this survey is weighting the data and getting it to represent the area. And there's lots of discussion of that on the website, but it measures things like employment, unemployment, economic activity, occupation, training, hours of work, and the personal characteristics of household members aged 16 years and over. People are randomly selected for this survey. This is the only one of the national surveys that I've been randomly selected for, and I did my 5 quarters of answering questions many years ago. It's quarterly. It's run from 1992 onwards. Around 60,000 people are interviewed per quarter, and as I said, those people are asked to take part 5 times. So the data sets you can get are quarterly, individual and household data sets, and a longitudinal data set that links the quarters. The graph on the right shows the hours worked, and you can see where the drop-off came when lockdown happened. So this was the period when furlough came in, when people's hours were reduced. And this is showing a gradual increase. So if you think of the life we live, we've been gradually increasing the amount of time we work. A bit of a drop after the financial crisis in 2008, steadily increasing, and then a really sharp drop when coronavirus hit and lockdown hit. Now this is the health survey for England. So it asks people about their general health, how they feel about it, any illnesses, long-standing, smoking and alcohol usage, and each year there's a focus topic. So this survey has run since 1991, currently runs at 13,000 interviews a year, and there are physical measurements and the analysis of blood samples here. So the report is available on that link, but if you look at public health guidance, there is, like all of the surveys, an annual report from the big surveys, and quite a nice infographic just to summarize some of the key things that have come out from that. So the next section I want to move on is, once you've kind of searched around and found something you might be interested in, there's quite a big learning curve in thinking about what the survey is doing, understanding it well. So for anybody doing this, don't underestimate this stage, is getting to grips with which of the variables you're going to use to operationalize your research question, understanding the documentation to understand any limitations, etc. So let's have a look at some of these documents. So this is the Understanding Society documentation for the COVID-19 study. So there's a lot of information in here. This study was started last year. There are 8 waves of data that have been collected. So there's a lot of information. It's been asked quite regularly. And the user guide is quite a large document that summarizes the design, how the sampling worked, the variables that were derived from the initial questions asked, how to use weights within the survey, the kind of funding behind it, and how to link this data to the main Understanding Society data set, which has more details about the individuals and households who are there. And on top of that, as somebody registered with the UK Data Service, you can use this data set as it stands. But if you want special access, which gives you access to particular elements like school details or local geographies, then you need to get special access, which means you need to fulfill certain conditions. And those are described within the documentation. You've got questionnaires for each wave, you've got a data dictionary for each wave, and you've got the information that is sent out to participants. So there is stacks of documentation with this survey. I suppose the starting point for me would always be to start with the user guide. Having decided what variables I might use, I might then be looking at the questionnaires. And here is an example of the kind of questions asked. So this is written for the person asking the question. So this is written for somebody on the telephone asking the question. So there's first of all a routing section first, and then the text that they ask. So have people previously had COVID symptoms and they haven't returned to their previous health? So this questionnaire is trying to get at the extent to which people are experiencing symptoms that might be associated with long COVID. So if you are interested in long COVID and the types of people who are receiving it, their characteristics, then this might be a starting point for you to look at. You might also be interested in the types of questions, the types of symptoms that people have. So if you look down, there's a lot of symptoms there. And on top of these kind of questions, there's also time and date stamps for the start and completion of the questionnaire. And then in terms of the resources tab, this is a particularly well-documented survey. I think it's run from a university, and it has lots of people publishing. It has an annual conference. But there are case studies that analyze key messages from the data set. A list of publications that have used the data set. That's not all publications, but the ones that have been notified to the data owner. Details of related studies and data sets. So, for example, Understanding Society followed on from the British Household Panel Survey, so you've got links to that data, which ran for 25 years before Understanding Society. And Understanding Society itself has a variable search facility. So if you're interested in a particular variable, you can go and search for it. Free text search, and it'll tell you in which ways that question was asked. So maybe, I can't remember the name of the person who asked about attitudes to different things, but if you were interested in those, you might use that kind of facility to search where the variable was, as well as the kind of resources we have. So I'm just going to pause for breath a minute there and talk about survey weights. So all of the survey data sets we were talking about contain weighting variables. So why do we do that? Well, we do a survey to understand something about the population. And in order to minimize the cost, we don't ask everybody in the population, we ask a sample of them. So if our population of interest is, say, 12 to 16-year-olds, and we're interested in their attitudes to a whole set of things, then we take a sample of that group, and then we test who's responded, so we can adjust. So if we have low rates of response from girls as opposed to boys, then we would weight girls more in the data set. Similarly, there are issues around potential racial groups. I think a note of caution here maybe because you need to be careful about weighting when the numbers are very small. So it's worth looking at both the numbers and the weights. But the idea is that you can then make claims about the population. So an example was the shelter example I used before, where they use the weights in the English Housing Survey to make claims about the number of families who are threatened with eviction or housing conditions for people. Generally, they're easy to use in statistics packages. So in statistics packages, you just tell the package to weight the data, and you will get a different set of information. So details are there in the survey documentation. Some of them get quite complex. So if we're looking at a survey that has a longitudinal element and an individual and household element, you will find different ways of using the weight. So if you're looking at individual analysis, you'll be using an individual weight. If you're looking at household analysis, you'll be looking at household weights. Over time in longitudinal analysis, there are further concerns which generally are addressed in the documentation for those. We have a set of guides that you can find on our website. So what is weighting? An introduction to using weights in social services, which is a video, how to use weights in Nestar, and guides to SPSS data and our data skills modules, which will include elements of weighting as well. So the next section is how can you get access to the data? So basically we have 3 levels of access. So the first level is open access. So you can go and get this data with few restrictions. It really applies to a small number of teaching data sets, which are very cut down from the survey data. Most survey data is safeguarded. So what you'll need to do is be registered with us and agree to the general conditions for use. That end user license then allows you to access the safeguarded files. There may be some additional conditions, so the data owner might have to approve or look at the use. The general principle is that what you're doing is for the public good. So in general, most of us working or studying in universities should have little difficulty meeting those conditions. The final stage is controlled access, and this is where data is particularly sensitive. So I think if you're looking at commercial data about businesses, if you're looking at data where there's a lot of individual detail held, then you'll need to go through a process of training to be accredited as somebody who can use the secure system, and you need to access it through a particular environment. So you can't just use it on your own machine. The control of what you put in and what you're allowed to take out of those is kind of managed for you. As a general guide, this is not available to undergraduate students. So the controlled access data requires you to do to either be employed or be a postgraduate student. So what I'm going to do now is switch over and take you through a little bit of the website. So can I just check if you can see this? Okay, that's great. So you can see it. So this is the landing page. The website has recently been revised. So it's a new, cleaner version. And if you look at it here, we've got the kind of key area to search the data catalog, which we'll do in a minute. We've also got a learning hub, so information about training in events, and below that, some different ways of looking at data, and a tour of the new website. So let's just have a look at browsing data by theme or type. So this reflects some of the things that you raised at the beginning. about what you're interested in. So let's have a look at environment and energy. So there's some description here. There's a series of key data sets. So energy follow-up survey, English housing survey, CO2 emissions. That must have been deposited by someone else. That looks like quite an interesting data set from 1751 to 2019. Environment statistics from the OECD, country level, and so on. This isn't really covering attitudes to the environment. It's more about, that looked like it was more physical. So if we look at another one, let's have a look at what we've got for COVID. So you can see here on the Business Insights and Conditions survey, we've got a secure access condition on here. The Community Life COVID-19 Recontact survey. Also, so a number of the surveys did specific things on COVID. It was included in some of the longitudinal studies. So let's just go into here to see where we get to next. So once you've identified it, you go back to the screen we showed you before, which was Understanding Society, the COVID-19 study, and you've got the details, the documentation, and the resources. So I'm just going to go back to the main screen again. So you can also just search in here. So if I wanted to search, you can see what I've looked at. If I was interested in attitudes, very broad set of interest. I've got lots of results back. So I might want to add in here attitudes to Brexit. And what I'm seeing here is a set of results, and these cover papers and data deposits that have been made. So if I go into there, so you can then see quite a lot of detail about somebody who's already done quite a lot of work about that and deposited the results of their work. So it might save you a journey through British social attitudes yourself to take something that has already been prepared. The last thing I want to show you is the Learning Hub. So this is where a lot of our resources can be accessed. So to start off with, you've got an introductory part on being new to using data. So it talks to you about what's in the collection, the tools you need to cite the data, and specifically information for students. A section on survey data, which will cover much of what we're saying now. Something about the tools, using Nestar, survey weights, etc. So much of what we've talked about is supported by material here. Some data skills modules. So these are video learning guides. So the introduction to survey data, the introduction to longitudinal data, and the introduction to aggregate data. There are other things here which I'm not going to cover today, but if your interest is in something like census data, international data, etc., you will find this is a good place to start to look. And then the final thing to show you while we're on the website is about training events. So we're now on this week. So this week is dissertation week for undergraduate students. We have a series of events running. This afternoon, there's a roadshow on climate change. There's this event. And then as you go down, you will see a variety of events around data management training, the safe researcher training, the research methods run by the National Centre for Research Methods, etc. And as you go on, you can look for what's there. Okay, it looks like quite a few people have kind of got what they want from this session. So it's been good to hear you. You will get a feedback form as you go out. If you could complete that, that will help us to improve what we do in future sessions. Thank you. And I'm still here for a while if you've got questions.